June 11, 1944. A muddy crossroads east of Villers-Bocage, Normandy. At precisely 11:17 in the morning, Corporal Elijah Carter sat inside a Sherman tank called Lucky 7, his eye pressed against the gunner's scope, watching a German vehicle creep into view through the gap in the hedgerow. It wasn't a Panzer IV. It wasn't a Tiger. It was something else entirely. Squat, unarmed, with a radio antenna stretching twice the height of its hull. His headset crackled with the same order he'd heard 3 times already. Hold fire. Repeat, hold fire, awaiting target confirmation. Carter's finger hovered over the trigger. His training screamed at him to wait, but his instinct told him something else. If he waited, people would die. Before we continue, take a moment to hit that like button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, whether it's Toronto, Tokyo, or Timbuktu. It's incredible to think we're all here together, decades later, remembering the moments that changed everything. Now back to that crossroads in Normandy, where one man was about to make a decision that would haunt him, save lives, and rewrite the rules of engagement. Carter fired. The 75mm shell tore through the humid June air, and 3 seconds later, the German command vehicle exploded in a burst of orange flame and black smoke. The shot was unauthorized. It was against orders, and it would become one of the most consequential single rounds fired in the entire Normandy campaign. Not because it destroyed a tank, but because it destroyed the brain directing an entire armored assault that no one else had seen coming. This is the story of the gunner who broke the rules, the shot that shattered a German offensive before it began, and the quiet burden of knowing you were right when the system told you to wait. Corporal Elijah Carter was 23 years old, born in the spring of 1921 in Newark, Ohio, a town of modest homes, rail yards, and Sunday church services. His father had died when he was 12, leaving his mother to raise 2 boys on a nurse's salary and sheer determination. Before the war, Carter drove a delivery truck for a local bakery, played third base in a town league, and spent his evenings reading repair manuals and tinkering with engines in his uncle's garage. He was the kind of young man who kept his head down, did his job, and didn't ask for attention. But he had steady hands and a sharp eye, and those qualities would soon matter more than anything else. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Carter didn't wait to be drafted. He volunteered in April 1942, choosing the Armored Division because he believed that's where the hardest, most necessary work would be done. At Fort Knox, Kentucky, he was assigned as a gunner on a Sherman tank crew, and it was there that his instructors noticed something unusual. Carter didn't just shoot well, he thought well. He calculated windage and elevation instinctively, adjusted for terrain without being told, and possessed an almost eerie ability to read a battlefield before it developed. One training sergeant wrote in his file, "This soldier doesn't react, he anticipates." By June 1944, Carter and his crew were part of the 4th Infantry Division, shipped to southern England for final preparations before D-Day. They spent 6 weeks in rain and mud, drilling for beach landings, hedgerow combat, and the brutal close-quarters fighting that defined the Bocage country of Normandy. Morale swung wildly, some days filled with dark humor and card games, others with silence and the weight of knowing what was coming. Carter's crew landed on Utah Beach on the morning of June the 6th. Unlike the carnage at Omaha, their landing was relatively smooth, but the days that followed were anything but. By the 2nd week of June, the Germans had begun their counterattack. The feared Panzer Lehr Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite armored units, had arrived to stall the Allied advance and push the Americans back into the sea. The Sherman tanks, including Carter's Lucky 7, were suddenly in daily combat against machines that were heavier, better armored, and crewed by veterans who knew how to kill. The odds were never in their favor. But Carter understood something critical. Sometimes in war, instinct had to override doctrine, and on June 11th, that understanding would be tested in the most consequential way imaginable. The days after D-Day were not filled with glory. They were filled with waiting, watching, and the slow, grinding tension of advancing through the bocage, a nightmare landscape of high hedgerows, sunken roads, and sudden ambushes where visibility was measured in yards, not miles. By June 10th, American progress had slowed to a crawl. Intelligence reports confirmed that Panzer Lehr Division was regrouping, preparing for a coordinated counterattack to retake lost ground and disrupt supply lines. The Sherman crews knew what that meant. They were outmatched, outgunned, and operating under strict rules of engagement designed to prevent friendly fire and civilian casualties. The orders were clear, repeated in every briefing, drilled into every tank commander's head. Do not fire unless you are fired upon first, or unless higher command confirms the target. No exceptions. The reasons were sound. Poor visibility made misidentification easy. American bombers flew regular sorties overhead, and French civilians still moved through the countryside. In tank warfare, fire discipline was sacred. But Carter was beginning to understand that rules designed for perfect conditions often broke down when the conditions were anything but perfect. On the morning of June 11th, he would learn just how far that understanding would take him. Lucky 7 was positioned at a crossroads east of Villers-Bocage, part of a three-tank defensive line covering a dirt road that curved through dense hedgerow country. Infantry hadn't yet cleared the woods to the east, and the tanks were ordered to hold position until reinforcements arrived. The crew had been awake for nearly 20 hours, surviving on cold rations, stale coffee, and adrenaline. At around 11:00 a.m., Carter was scanning through his periscope when he spotted it. A vehicle moving slowly along the tree line, stopping at intervals as if marking positions or directing traffic. It wasn't shaped like any Panzer he'd been trained to recognize. The vehicle had no turret, no main gun, just a tall, rectangular hull and an oversized whip antenna rising from its rear like a flagpole. Carter leaned closer, his pulse quickening. Behind it, two Panzer tires followed at a cautious distance, not advancing aggressively but moving with deliberate coordination. This wasn't a spearhead. This was a command formation. Carter reached for the radio handset and reported the sighting to his tank commander, Lieutenant Grant. Grant squinted through his own scope, said nothing, and called higher up the chain. The reply came back minutes later. Do not engage until identification is confirmed. That was it. No context, no urgency. Just wait. Carter sat in silence, his eye fixed on the vehicle. Through the scope, he watched as two German officers dismounted from the rear hatch. One carried a map case. The other raised field binoculars and scanned the tree line, directly toward Carter's position. They had no idea they were being watched. Carter called it in again, his voice tight but controlled. Unarmed command variant spotted. Antenna confirmed. Two officers exposed. Requesting engagement clearance. The response was immediate and flat. Negative. Await visual confirmation from recon. Maintain position. Hold fire. Carter bit the inside of his cheek, tasting iron. Through the lens, he saw one of the German officers raise his hand and point, directly toward the left flank, where American infantry was still setting up defensive positions. A moment later, the Panzertwars behind the command vehicle began rotating their turrets in that same direction. They were preparing to strike. Carter's mind raced through the possibilities. This was a Panzerbefehlswagen, a mobile command tank used to coordinate armored assaults in real time. If it stayed in position, it would direct a coordinated push that could punch through the thinly defended American line, overrun supply depots, and cut off reinforcements. Knock it out, and the entire formation would lose its eyes, its voice, its brain. He reached for the radio one more time. "Sir, this is Carter. I'm looking right at them. It's a command variant. No mistake." Lieutenant Grant's voice came back, cool but cautious. "Stand down, Corporal. Higher command says wait for recon. No exceptions." From behind, the loader, Private Marsh, whispered, "You sure it's what you think it is?" Carter didn't answer. He was watching the officer with the binoculars, still pointing, still coordinating. Time was slipping away. Every second lost was another step closer to disaster. Carter exhaled slowly, his hand steady on the trigger wheel. He thought of the infantry down the road, the ones with no armor, no warning, no chance if those panzers rolled forward. He thought of the rules, the consequences, the court-martial that could follow an unauthorized shot. Acha, his entire career, his freedom, his future, all of it hung in the balance. But then he thought of something else, the weight of doing nothing. The weight of watching a disaster unfold because he followed orders instead of his instincts. Through the scope, the officer was still pointing. The antenna was still waving. The panzers were still aligning. This was the moment, the last safe second. Carter tightened his grip, adjusted elevation just half a degree, and made his decision. He fired. The Sherman bucked violently as the 75mm armor-piercing round left the barrel with a deafening boom and a flash of white-hot light. The recoil rocked the entire tank, slamming Carter's shoulder into the padding. Private Marsh shouted, "What the hell did you do?" Carter didn't answer. His eye was already back in the scope, tracking the round. He saw it fly, a dark blur against the green Normandy countryside, and then he saw it strike. The shell punched straight through the lightly armored side of the command vehicle, and for a heartbeat nothing happened. Then the vehicle erupted. The explosion was not massive, not the Hollywood fireball of gasoline and shrapnel. It was tight, surgical, devastating. Flames burst from the top hatch. One officer flung himself out, landing limp on the roadside. The other disappeared in a flash of orange. The antenna snapped in half and collapsed like a broken flagpole. Black smoke billowed upward, thick and oily, marking the wreckage like a funeral pyre. And then came the chaos. The Panzer Arvs behind the command vehicle froze, their turrets swiveling in confusion. Without their command vehicle, they had no orders, no direction, no brain. Carter spun his turret toward the nearest panzer and yelled, "Load high explosive! Now!" Marsh, still rattled, slammed the next shell into the breach. But Carter never had to fire again. The German tanks began to retreat, not a panicked rout, but a deliberate, cautious withdrawal back into the tree line. The formation had collapsed. The assault, whatever it had been, was over before it began. Inside Lucky 7, no one spoke. Lieutenant Grant, who had climbed halfway into the hatch, just stared at the column of black smoke rising from the destroyed vehicle. Finally, he looked down at Carter, his expression unreadable. "You fired without orders," he said. It wasn't a question. Carter looked up, his face streaked with sweat and grime. "Yes, sir." Grant was silent for a long moment. Then he muttered, "Good shot," and dropped back inside. The fallout came swiftly. By noon, the crossroads had been secured by American infantry, and the wreckage of the German command vehicle sat smoldering in the mud like a monument to a decision made in seconds. Headquarters sent investigators, 2 officers in a jeep, armed with cameras, notepads, and regulations. They questioned Carter and his crew one by one, documenting every detail, what he saw, when he saw it, why he fired. Carter told the truth. He explained the antenna, the officers, the hand signals, the formation of the panzers. He described his calculations, his instinct, his belief that waiting would cost lives. The investigators took notes, measured the blast site, photographed the wreckage. They said nothing about punishment. Not yet. That evening, Lieutenant Grant found Carter sitting outside the tent line, staring into the distance. "They're not pressing charges," Grant said quietly. Carter blinked, processing the words. "Nothing. They called it a tactically appropriate judgment call under conditions of incomplete communication." Grant gave a short, humorless laugh, "which I think is code for, you saved our ass, but we don't want to encourage it." Carter exhaled for the first time in hours. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He just nodded. Grant sat down beside him. Was it the right call? Carter didn't answer immediately. Then he said, almost to himself, "It was the only one that mattered." 2 days later, field engineers arrived to process the wreckage. What they found confirmed everything. Inside the half-destroyed hull of the Panzer Befehlswagen, they recovered a scorched but partially intact field map. Its edges were burned, but the center remained legible. Penciled lines, arrows, unit designations, all pointing toward American positions. One arrow marked the exact coordinates of Carter's crossroads. Another pointed to a field hospital 2 kilometers west. The Germans had been planning a coordinated assault at dawn, using that command vehicle as the control hub. Had Carter waited for confirmation, the vehicle would have moved to higher ground, directed artillery, and orchestrated an attack that would have overrun supply lines, medical stations, and exposed infantry positions. The intelligence officer who reviewed the map issued a terse, one-line report. Immediate action taken by Allied armor at Grid 07 prevented an imminent tactical breach. That Allied armor was Lucky 7. That immediate action was Carter's unauthorized shot. The report circulated quietly up the chain of command. No headlines, no press releases. Just a quiet acknowledgement that one gunner's instinct had stopped a disaster no one else had seen coming. A few days later, Carter was awarded the Bronze Star. The ceremony was brief, conducted in a muddy field with no fanfare. The citation noted his initiative and decisive action under threat of enemy maneuver. It didn't mention the word unauthorized. It didn't need to. Word spread slowly through the division. Other gunners began nodding when Carter passed. Some saluted. A few asked what had tipped him off, how he knew. Carter never gave speeches, never bragged. He simply said the moment didn't feel like it would wait. Lieutenant Grant, normally a stickler for protocol, stopped correcting Carter when he adjusted equipment on his own or skipped routine briefings. In a small, unspoken way, things had shifted. Carter wasn't above the rules, but he had proven that sometimes the rules needed a man who could think beyond them. The destroyed command vehicle sat beside the road for weeks, a blackened, twisted monument to a decision that had no time for committees. For Carter, the shot was never about glory. It was about the quiet, crushing weight of a single moment when the world narrows to a choice. Follow the system, or follow what you know to be true. He replayed it often. The hesitation, the calculation, the trigger pull. What if he had waited? What if he had blinked? The Germans would have advanced. Men would have died. Reports would be filed. And Carter would have carried that knowledge for the rest of his life. That was the real weight. Not what he had done, but what he might have failed to do. He never told the full story, not even to his crew. The details stayed with him. The angle of the sunlight, the officer's pointing hand, the instinct that felt more like certainty than guess. One night, weeks later, while bivouacked beside a ruined church outside Caen, Lieutenant Grant sat beside him by the fire. "I looked over that map again," Grant said quietly. "We were dead center in their line of attack. Your shot saved more than just us." Carter stared into the flames, watching sparks drift upward into the dark. "I didn't do it for us," he said. Grant looked at him. "Then why?" Carter was silent for a long time. Then he said, almost to himself, "Because I could see it. Not what might happen, what would. I felt it, like a picture in my mind." He didn't speak again that night, but the words stayed with him forever. In the months that followed, Carter would fire his gun dozens more times. He would knock out tanks, fortifications, machine gun nests. He would help liberate towns and bury friends. But nothing ever quite felt like that shot on June 11th. It was the only one that ever felt personal, the only one where the rules said no, and his instinct said yes, and the weight of the world sat in the space between. Years later, after the war, when Carter returned to Ohio, he kept a small box in his closet. Inside was the bronze star he never displayed, a faded photograph of his tank crew, and a folded map with German markings still faintly visible, its edges charred. He never explained what it meant, but when his children asked about the war, he would pause, look off into the distance, and say, "Sometimes you only get one moment to do the right thing. The rest of your life just tries to live up to it." Courage isn't found in the system, but in the silence before the trigger pull, when you choose the right thing over the allowed thing. Elijah Carter fired, and in that single moment of lonely discernment, he proved one person can change everything.